Welcome to Everything Co-op, bringing you information on how cooperatives can help improve your quality of life. This show is being sponsored by the National Co-op Bank, NCB. The NCB is dedicated to strengthening communities nationwide for the delivery of banking and financial services for the nation's cooperatives, their members, and other socially responsible organizations. For more information on the power of community ownership, visit ncb.coop. That's ncb.coop. Now stay tuned for your host, Vernon Oakes.
Good morning. Welcome to Everything Cooperative this morning. This is Vernon Oakes, your host. And we have Mr. Jim Joseph on the line. And we're going to explore the question is, did Mr. Mandela, the president of South Africa, use the concept of Ubuntu, U-B-U-N-T-U, to be able to work with the South Africans that had put him in prison, to use this concept of Ubuntu to bring the country together to work cooperatively and not have civil war. And Mr. Jim Joseph is on the phone. Good morning, Jim.
Good morning, Vernon. How are you?
I'm great.
Very well.
Can you tell us what the definition of Ubuntu is?
Well, it's a concept of community that emphasizes the interconnectedness of our humanity. It's probably best expressed by the Xhosa proverb, people are people through other people. As a philosophy, it is grounded in an African probably an African humanism, and it emphasizes humaneness and the belief in a universal bond that connects all of humanity. It's not the Western notion of I think, therefore I am, but an African notion of I am because you are. It's what led people like Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu and others to say, to deny your dignity is to deny my own. To diminish your humanity is to diminish my own. As a matter of fact, the ethic was so deeply ingrained in the Southern African personality that even warring tribes had war healers whose duty it was to come together after battle to restore both the victor and the victim into full standing in the community. It is often said of those who practice Ubuntu have a short memory of hate.
Okay. A short memory of hate. That's wonderful. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got to be the U.S. ambassador of South Africa? I understand you were reared in Louisiana.
Yeah, well, let's clarify. It was the United States ambassador to South Africa,
okay,
not of South Africa. I was such an advocate for South Africa that some people may have gotten confused, but my appointment was actually the United States ambassador to South Africa. I was appointed by President Clinton, and I served for 4 years. 3 of those years was at the time that Nelson Mandela was president. Now, you asked the question of how I got to be an ambassador. I had been involved with the issues of South Africa for most of my adult life and even visited South Africa in 1974 as an anti-apartheid activist. I had been very involved in the movement against the anti-apartheid movement in the United States. And so I was very familiar with the issues. But even beyond that, this was a new democracy.
And I had been involved in
or more on all 3 sectors of our democracy.
Did you know Pinocchio was a bad motivational speaker?
And civil society. So I brought with me the experience of democracy, not just in government, but in all 3 sectors.
When you talk about civil society, can you explain what that is? I got the public sector, and the private
civil
sector.
Society. Let me just clarify the distinction. Then, the private sector, you might say, is driven by the market. The public sector is driven by ballots. The third, or so-called independent sector, is driven by voluntarism and the work of nonprofit organizations that seek to serve a public good.
How did you end up out of Louisiana and doing all of this? Were you born into wealth?
A long road. Absolutely not. I was born in a very low-income community in Cajun country in Louisiana. My father was a local minister, and we were not always sure whether he was going to earn enough for us to be able to have bread on the table every day. That's the kind of background. It was a low-income community in rural Louisiana. And my life road took me through many other areas. Of course, I went to undergraduate school at Southern University in Louisiana, graduate school at Yale University, getting a degree in ethics and theology. I was a university chaplain. I became a vice president of a transnational business corporation. I was president of the Council on Foundations, an international organization with members in 5 continents. And I was in the Carter administration as the Undersecretary of the Interior, just to mention a few of my experiences.
Okay, one of the reasons I wanted you to tell our listeners a little bit about your background is what gives you the knowledge to talk about this concept, this philosophy of Ubuntu or Mandela's role in it. But the other thing is, I'm just so proud to know you. From that humble background to everything that you've been able to do in life.
Well, let me just add, since you talk about Mr. Mandela, I was ambassador during the 90s when Mr. Mandela was president, but I have been living full or part-time in South Africa for the last 18 years, and so I have been jointly serving as a professor at Duke University's School of Public Policy and the Graduate School of Business at the University of Cape Town. And I've also been running a leadership training program for Southern African leaders and leaders from communities of color in the United States. And so my involvement with that country goes back to my first trip as an anti-apartheid activist in 1974.
And what was your activity with the civil rights movement here in the U.S.?
I was one of the organizers and founders and later one of the chairs of the civil rights movement in Tuscaloosa, Alabama.
Tuscaloosa. Okay, I like that word. Jim, it's amazing that you've been able to do so much. And when I talk to middle school students and high school students, I talk about the transition from, in your case, Southern Louisiana don't have enough money sometimes to put food on the table, to vice president of corporations, ambassador to the U.S., and it's like that preparation. It's what happens between that time in Louisiana to being in South Africa or being in corporate boardrooms. And it sounds like the preparation was undergraduate and in graduate school. Is there any other preparation for those kinds of positions?
Well, I suspect that all of the things I have done led from one experience to another. And the preparation was not just in the academic community. It was in the organizations that shaped my values and socialized me in many ways, and that certainly would include the church, and that would include, at least in the time in which I live, my neighbors and friends, all of whom influenced me. But the influence goes academic discipline they taught, but in developing the individual as a whole person. And so I think you could say that one experience led to another. So from high school to college to university to social activism, to business, to government, and to civil society.
Congratulations. Life well lived. I want to go back to Ubuntu again. Do you have a sense of how it got started?
Well, it's an ancient concept in Southern Africa, but it has only in recent years caught the attention of scholars who are concerned about social cohesion, or activists who are concerned about the obligations of citizenship. When I was living in South Africa, I became curious about the genesis of the concept and what had been written about it. And so I went into the library in the university where I was teaching to do some research on the concept. And the first sort of South African analytical source that I could find, really the reference to the term in the mid-19th century. Now, it was so infused into the life of the culture that, while people practiced it in much earlier time, they did not speak or write about it until much later. It was a way of being, which everybody understood, but there wasn't much written about it. The concept was not popularized as a worldview until the 1950s, I think. The first references that I could find of a popular nature were articles in the African Drum, which was a magazine in South Africa, a black magazine. And in the 1950s, there were a number of articles written that contrasted the Africana pluralism that emphasized divisions.
Jim, we're going to have to take a break, so could you hold on to that? And when we get back, we're going to talk about this Genesis. We'll pick up there, and then I want to go into some of the Christian pieces of this. So if you could hold on, we'll be right back.
All right.
Please don't touch that dial.
DCNews.com.
This is Vernon Oaks talking to you about everything cooperative. Cooperatives are businesses. Any kind of business can be a co-op. We normally in America think about the capitalistic model of shareholders, but co-ops are business if they are owned by the people that work in the business, the employees. It's called a worker co-op. And if it's owned by the people that use the products or the services, it's called a consumer co-op. And so what we're at the heart of a co-op is community and cooperation between the people that work in or that business or buy the products from the business. And so we have Mr. Jim Joseph today talking to us about Ubuntu, which is a philosophy in Southern Africa. It's a way of being is how he's described it. And he was telling us before we took break about some of the research that he was doing when he lived and worked in South Africa as the U.S. ambassador to South Africa. And he was telling us about some articles that he'd read in the African Drum, a South African newspaper. Jim, could you continue the conversation?
Yeah, the African Drum was a black magazine published in the old days of apartheid by the black community. Let me just want to add a couple of other things to the history we were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
It was probably in the 1970s that Ubuntu began to be seen more broadly as a specific kind of humanism to be found in black Africans, but something that was absent from white Africans who populated a very separate and exploitive space. In a 1999 book, Archbishop Desmond Tutu wrote that it was the self-assurance that comes from knowing that one belongs to a greater whole. The term even appears in the South African Constitution as it asserts a new kind of citizenship, the idea that the country belongs to all who live in it. And I think that's a sort of good grounding to try to understand the role of cooperation and the importance of being seen as not just an individual who has individual initiatives, but also a part of something bigger than oneself. And you said you want to talk about it in the Bible, and it's important to note that even in Ubuntu, the emphasis was on the fact that the individual was part of something bigger and more mysterious than the self. You asked me as we broke up before about the Christian community. Mm-hmm. The Bible is full of images and imperatives of community that emphasize the importance of working together. Community in the New Testament is described by a Greek word which means joint participation, sharing, teamwork, and communion. Christians call it koinonia, which in a spiritual sense highlights a higher purpose or mission that benefit the greatest good of the members as a whole. Another way and another place that one finds this notion of community in the New Testament is in the writings of the Apostle Paul, in which he also talks about the notion of koinonia, and it's expressed not just as a place or state of being, but as one which transcends race, gender, or ethnicity. As those familiar with the New Testament remember, he made a distinction said there was no distinction to be made between either male or female, slave or free, Jew or Gentile, or the many other hyphens we use to identify ourselves. And so this notion of joint participation, this notion of belonging to each other that we talked about in Ubuntu is clearly also in the Christian community and certainly the biblical text.
You know, it's amazing that it seemed like in America, at least my growing up, was with the Lone Ranger and John Wayne on TV, and it was always, I pulled myself up by the bootstraps. I did this on my own. And that seems to be, at least in the business school, getting an MBA, it was like you go out there and you work on your own and you strive and you get it and you do it on your own. That's so different from this concept of Ubuntu or koinonia.
Yes.
And so how do you think this came about? And you said that the white South Africans had a different concept. Did they have the same concept of individualism or?
Well, they had a strong sense of individualism, and of course they were united as an Africana community, but that focus on humanity was a focus on humanity in its many categories, and so the focus was on division of humanity, while the black Africans were focusing on the interconnectedness of humanity. So that's found a sort of clash of concepts of community, and that is why the notion of reconciliation and forgiveness, which became a part of the tradition of Ubuntu, was so critical in the negotiation of a new democracy.
Reconciliation and forgiveness. That seems to be hard for a lot of people to do, forgive.
Well, I think it's one of the contributions that Nelson Mandela made to the public discourse about community, as well as to private reality. I I tried to understand what was the source of this notion of forgiveness and this focus on reconciliation, and I sort of had to go back to Ubuntu because it placed a high premium on dignity, or compassion, and respect for the humanity of another, and you had to contrast it with vengeance. The emphasis was on restorative justice rather than distributive justice. And it focused and favored civility and civilized dialogue premised on mutual tolerance. And the negotiations that took place to develop the democracy were not around just contested ideas about what it means to be a democracy, but contrasting ideas about what it means to be a national community. And the emphasis by those steeped in Ubuntu was not on simply the kind of things that I should do for myself, but my obligations to the community. And that is what is important to remember about that concept of community as it was infused into the public life of the nation.
Well, one of the reasons I really have become passionate about this cooperative business model is because that's what's embedded in it. It's not doing for self, it's obligation to the community. And so decisions, Jim, I've been doing property management, so I started managing housing co-ops, and this is how I even found out about this concept. And when we're in a boardroom, the decisions are made on what's best for the community, not what's best for an individual. And those co-ops that I've seen, housing co-ops that have failed, take on this what's best for the individual. And too often that's no integrity with the bylaws of the co-op, and sometimes fraudulent behavior and stuff. But those are the ones that end up failing. But the ones that succeed, which most do, is because they're deciding what is best for the group, what's best for the community, what's best for the total group, not for any individual. And that's the passion that I have for this business model over the capitalistic model. Says I get in it and I see what's best for me. I get return on my investment. That's the total focus, not the total, but too often that is the majority focus, which leads toward greed for the individual, as opposed to, if you will, greed for the group. I mean, what's best for the group. So I like this business model a lot because of that.
Well, I think the regulatory framework in which capitalism is forced to operate in a democracy also emphasizes a responsibility to a variety of stakeholders rather than just the shareholder. And so I wouldn't offer a critique of the capitalist model as somehow anti-social responsibility, as it works itself out for many in that sector. One sees that kind of selfishness and greed you talk about. But in its ideal sense, it is possible for capitalism to have a kind of an ethic in which one asks what is good for all of our stakeholders. I worked, as you know, for 10 years at Cummins Engine Company, and one of the responsibilities I had was to work with management to make sure that we were meeting our responsibilities to the community as well as to the worker. And so it is possible to have a capitalistic model that is concerned about, as I say, all of the stakeholders. It is true that many examples that, and I'm sure you can cite many, seems to be limited in that regard, but it is possible to have such a model.
Well, that's one of the reasons I think you were probably drawn to Cummins Engine Company, and so was I, is that because it had a vision of the world for all people. It was, and it had social responsibility as key in what it did from day to day around the world.
Yeah. We were asking not just the question, what does it mean to be effective? What does it mean to be efficient in a traditional sense? But what does it mean to be responsible? And responsibility for us started with the decision to do business, where you locate a plant.
Well, we're going to take that responsibility up, Jim, right when we come back. Sorry about that, but we've got to step right away. We'll be right back.
1450 WOL.
Information is power. This is Vernon Oakes. We're talking about cooperation, building community. The National Cooperative Bank sponsors this program to give you the benefits of cooperatives, which is a business model. But we're talking about Ubuntu, which is a philosophy, a way of being in Southern Africa. And Mr. Jim Joseph is our guest. He was the ambassador to South Africa when Mr. Mandela was president. He has a long history of social activism. And we were talking about this whole concept of doing things for self, or making decisions. Too often in the capitalistic U.S. model is doing things for self, where in Ubuntu is the obligation to community, obligation to the group. So, Jim, how has this Ubuntu changed your world?
Well, I said earlier when we were talking that my graduate work was in ethics, and I have always felt that I had an obligation to infuse values or integrate values into whatever work I was doing, whether it was in business, government, and civil society. And so I think that the values of community that we talked about with Mandela were with me from the very beginning of my life. It started out coming out of my religious faith, but I came to understand that concepts like Ubuntu embraced the same kind of ethic that Desmond Tutu affirmed as a bishop, but it also came out of his life as an African, familiar with the concept of Ubuntu. I found that Ubuntu helps us to understand that hatred corrodes the personality and damages the emotional health of the hater. Now, that's a powerful concept that we need to think about and try to use in communities.
Can you say that again, please?
Ubuntu helps us to understand that hatred corrodes the personality and damages the emotional health of the hater. That's what Martin Luther King sort of had in mind when he talked about loving the enemy, which was a Christian concept. But in Ubuntu, you have this notion that it is in our self-interest to forgive. It is in our self-interest to be reconciled. It's more than just a moral imperative. So Mandela understood that forgiveness was in the self-interest of individuals as well as the nation. And when you look at concrete examples, it enabled Mandela to invite his jailers, the warden from the prison which he had served, to his inauguration. It led him to set up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to provide amnesty for the perpetrators of gross human rights violation. And finally, I think it's important to understand that it led him to stand up for his values, but also enabled him to be a practical man who knew when and how to compromise on strategies. I always like to say that he could have stood for absolutes and pleased his conscience, but accomplished nothing for his constituents. And so he stood for the values of Ubuntu, but he was willing to negotiate and compromise on the strategies for implementing those values.
So in a sense, he was being selfish.
Well, that's selfish is a hard word.
Okay.
And I mean that he understood that this was a place for the congruence of both self-interest and public interest. And selfishness focuses primarily on self-interest.
Okay.
But here, there was this fusion of self-interest and public interest.
Well, I guess I was going to use the word, it's the wrong word for the real reason you just gave the definition to, but it's like when you're helping somebody else, when you forgive, when you have somebody that has hurt as much as he was hurt, when he can forgive them, it helps himself. It takes the hatred out of his being so that he doesn't get corroded. He doesn't get warped in a way, in a sense. And that's what I was using that term, but it's the wrong term.
And of course, I just objected to the use of the word selfish because I really, as I said, I think that's a stronger term than balancing self-interest and public interest, which is really what I like to talk about and what I think Mandela had in mind. But the point is that who he was and how he conducted his private life, as well as how he conducted the public business of the democracy, was infused and grounded in that concept of Ubuntu.
Well, you know, one of the reasons I brought that up is because in my walk, and Jim, I'll turn 67 next month. I know you got a couple years on me, but I have found that getting into Christianity, getting to the church, studying the Bible, you find that there are things that just sort of not just automatic. They're like, for instance, if I decided that you have a tie on that I want, when I was a kid, I thought if I just took that tie, I would be better off. If I just somehow stole that tie from you and I got the tie now and you don't, then you're worse off and I'm better off. But not understanding that there's a conscious and there's the spiritual world, and that world, you're not better off. The same thing is if somebody hurts me, and Jesus says, somebody hits you, turn the other cheek, and that's just not intuitive. Because if somebody hits me, I want to hit them back. Particularly when I was a kid or younger man, if somebody did imprison me, I would want to imprison them. And to get to the place where you understand that, and Ubuntu is what we're talking about, but when somebody hits you, you're better off forgiving them, and if anything, doing something good for them as opposed to doing something bad for them. You end up being better off. That's just not intuitive.
Yeah. Well, I think the example you use is a good reminder of the distinction between hard power and soft power. Hard power may lead to immediate relief, but soft power may be far more enduring. And so one has to ask, what is the goal you're trying to accomplish? People are very quick and ready to turn to and emphasize hard power. And whether that's in public life where you're talking about military might and economic muscle, or whether that's in private management or just the way you conduct your life as a person, it is clear that soft power, the emphasis on forgiveness, reconciliation, nonviolence, is likely to be more enduring. And it is because it is in many ways most seductive. And what Mandela was, what he had in great supply, was the ability to seduce the adversary into liking him. And that's a really big weapon in trying to gain an advantage or to try to get the adversary to share your concept of community.
And he was well known for that, except when in his death, if you listen to the commentaries, they try to decide if he was angry or not. And some said he really was, but he didn't let that rule him.
He was human. Mm-hmm. And all of us, there is this capacity for anger. And it's not that you don't get angry, but that you've learned to manage that anger so that you use it in productive ways. We left the last segment. We had started to talk about the notion of a concept like Ubuntu in doing business. Mm-hmm. And I was starting to say that a responsible corporation is responsible in everything it does. A responsible corporation is one that locates a site responsibly. It hires a workforce responsibly. It compensates that workforce responsibly. It manufactures a product or provides a service responsibly. It distributes the return on its investment responsibly. It is very careful about its impact on communities and neighborhood. And so in the notion and my model of a responsible corporation, it is something that can be done. And the concern, even in making profits, is not just in making profits, but how profits are made becomes a question of responsibility as well. And so I just wanted to go back and reiterate that point, that it is possible for a business corporation to be responsible.
Well, we can shout out for Cummins because it has been responsible, and it, as far as I know, still is in all of those aspects that you're talking about. But the thing with the cooperative business model is that it's normally born out of solving some community problem, and because the workers in a lot of cases own the business, that they will do things that's responsible for the workers, and they get that if they provide a good product or service, they're doing things that's good for the community. And most of the co-ops that I know and have talked to on this program and other places have the fifth or sixth principle of co-ops is concern for the community and working cooperatively with other co-ops. So it has in its DA that automatic social responsibility. It doesn't necessarily need an organization or a group or division to sort of help it, where too often, and I don't know how often too often is, 5% of the time, 10% of the time or more, where there's this struggle between making a profit and doing what's responsible, that it takes money off the bottom line and perhaps do the responsible things. And I suggest too often those in that lead will make the decision that's best for the individual, not for the group.
Well, people like to think of being responsible as taking money off the bottom line. I think it contributes to the bottom line.
Okay.
It is a part of the bottom line when it's infused into the company in its relationship to all of its stakeholders, as I have been describing it, that the company is likely to be more profitable precisely because it is responsible.
You know, I really wish, I love that concept, and I believe it also, is getting people to operate with that knowledge and getting perhaps business schools that teach that. I'm not sure that I got that.
It's a deeper problem in the society that is just deeper than what is taught about cooperatives. There's a tendency to over-romanticize the role of private individuals and to de-emphasize the role of cooperative endeavors in the building of private wealth and even in promoting private work. And so it's a societal problem. We seem somehow to forget that it was public resources, for example, that helped create wealth for many who now insist that poverty should be addressed primarily through private compassion. It's reliably estimated that America's broad-based middle class accumulated as much as two-thirds of its wealth through home ownership enabled more by federal action than by what now some romanticize as private thrift. And so we have, when we look at the American narrative, there is this myth of individualism without understanding that our real history was shaped by both the private initiatives of individuals and the cooperative endeavors of the community. And so it's not either or. It is a kind of individualism that you find in Ubuntu, which is in the context of community, rather than something that is totally different from the communitarian tradition.
Don't touch the dial. We'll be right back. And Jim, our hour is almost gone. We have one more segment. We'll be right back with Jim Joseph.
News updates on the web at WOLDCnews.com.
This is Vernon Oakes talking to you about cooperatives and the benefits of cooperatives. We have Mr. Jim Joseph on the line with us. And Jim, you're talking about the myth of individualism in America and the role of community and how both are necessary. But I'd like for you to go back and talk a little bit more about how in the American tax system, we get a chance to write off the interest, and the government ends up paying for the house, that individual house or condominium. But then people say that giving welfare could be bad or wrong or something, and that people don't need it or shouldn't give it. So can you talk a little bit more about these resources, how they're used to create income, but also assets, particularly the middle class and home ownership?
Right. The thing about it is income helps you to get along, but you need assets to get ahead. Yeah. And so what the focus is too often on is just enabling people to just get along. And that has certainly been true in low-income communities. And they never really had an opportunity to build assets. And that is because of this myth of individualism. When we look at American history, we realize that it was public subsidies that gave a head start to many people who now have wealth.
And that could be in terms of the farmers, the railroad barons.
That's right. The 19th Century Homestead Act, the Federal Housing Administration loans, land and water subsidy, the GI Bill, and, of course, the use of the tax codes to subsidize home ownership, property, and wealth. It's interesting to note that people who got their start through subsidy from public resources are the first to say that we should not provide subsidy for the poor. They disparage the subsidy for the poor by calling it welfare, while the welfare that gave them their start they call subsidy. And so we need a kind of new language which really talks about how wealth was created in this country.
There was a study done of a housing co-op in Atlanta, and one called Wildwood, and it's been in existence for 40 years. And how people have created not only financial wealth, and these people, it's affordable housing. HUD gave the money, but the money's been paid off, which is very interesting. And so the government got its money back. But these people, they said had a 7.1% return on their investment. It could be $1,000, $500 investment. But today, because the people that live there make their own decisions and they're owners, they take better care of the property, so maintenance are not as high. And because they don't have the return on investment at 10, 12, 18% that somebody gets, so that there have not been these increases in the rents, if you will, so that the rent is $500 a month for a two-bedroom in this place in Atlanta, but down the street it would be $700 to $800 a month. So it seemed like they're creating wealth, they're creating social wealth because they end up learning how to live together, work together, how to, when they have differences, if you have two people together in a marriage, you have differences. If you have 250, as they do in this place, there's definitely different. But how do you resolve those differences and work together to make decisions best for everybody? It just seems to be a win-win, but I can't get the government. HUD is giving their money to apartment buildings now, not to co-ops. So it's how to change this notion that you're talking about, this myth of individualism and welfare is bad and so forth.
Well, our public policy has not caught up with our ideals here, because I think a lot of people talk about the tradition of community, but what we hear most about is the myth of the individualism and the sort of Lone Ranger heroes, and the notion that I did it myself, and there was no one else involved. And when you look at the history, you find that lots of others were involved, and lots of public resources were involved. And so I think we need to begin to educate people to understand how people got to be poor and how some people accumulated wealth. And I'm not naive about the limitations of public resources, but I'm simply advocating that our government do for today's low income what it has always done in helping people to help themselves, and that people who have accumulated wealth understand that the public often contributed, their neighbors often contributed. Even in the myth of individualism, we romanticize the initiatives of individuals, but when we really remember our history, we remember that neighbors came together to help build each other's barns, to take in the crops before the rains came. And so there has always been this cooperative endeavor alongside of the initiatives of individuals. And so we need a new mindset, a sort of new paradigm, which is really based on what the reality of our past rather than the myths about our past.
Yeah, and I really like that in South Africa they put Ubuntu, and it's always been in their culture, but it's in their, you said, in their constitution now. Yeah,
well, the notion of South Africa belongs to all who live in it. That's a radical idea of citizenship.
Okay.
And it is one that we can learn from South Africa about. Now, I don't want to over-romanticize the concept of Ubuntu because in its ideal form, one founded in the early revolutionaries who provided the first generation of leadership for the country. But many of the Western people are more focused on the Western notion of I think, therefore I am, rather than I am because you are. And so that I hope the ideal remains and more people try to integrate it into what they do. But the reality is that those advocates of Ubuntu are passing away.
Thanks a lot, buddy.
Okay.
We'll be back next Thursday. Bye now.
News updates on the web at WOLDCnews.com.